I hope your casserole isn't in the oven. Psalm 119, 133 says, "Guide my steps by your word, so I will not be overcome by evil." Proverbs 16:9 says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." I'm going to do a lot of looking down and reading today, so bear with me. You'll get the idea regardless. Somewhere in the mid-90s, I was going to pharmacy school at Oregon State. One afternoon, I was studying in the pharmacy building library, and that's only notable because I rarely studied there. It's just not, I usually study in the big library, but I was there that day. I think it was kind of warm, and I remember feeling a strong throbbing in one spot on my forehead. Not really painful, but it got my attention. Then I felt this kind of tingling that traveled from there around to the back, and I became very aware that my left arm didn't feel like it was where it looked like it was. I since learned that that is called, that I had lost proprioception in my arm. It's a big word. Proprioception is basically the ability to tell where parts of your body are in space relative to each other and other known objects. Get a little bit of a science lesson today too. You use proprioception to touch your nose with your eyes closed. I wasn't aware I had lost anything else other than my concentration, and about as much time as it just took to explain that, it was all gone. Everything was back to normal. At some point later that afternoon, I met Gina in the Commons area for lunch, and I think it happened again while we were talking. I remember the same symptoms occurring 4 times that day, and my recollection is that it happened twice the next day and progressively less over the next couple of days. Gina and I had only been married for about a year or two, and we were dirt poor financially. That's an understatement. We had no medical insurance, and because that was legal back then. And I went over to the student health center, and the doctors did all kinds of neuro exams, but the symptoms were only transient, so I tested normal. He speculated I was having what he called a migraine equivalent. He said, "I think you're having an aura like people get prior to or during a migraine, but without the pain." I remember as I was leaving the building, the symptoms came back. It had been just a matter of seconds since I had seen the doc, so I just ran back into his office. I said, "It's happening." He did some neuro exams at the end, but by the time he started, the symptoms had resolved. I wasn't giving him much to go on. At some point, whether at this visit or another, I don't recall, he suggested that I get an MRI. We actually found a post-it note that's not emotional, in a filing cabinet. They had written a price on it. It was something like $947 or thereabouts. Again, no insurance, so that wasn't anything I was excited about. Back then, $947 was an extra term of classes. Not today, but back then. As I said before, it quit happening over the next 4 days or so, only coming back once, as I recall, in the next few weeks when I was helping Dad move some brush, and then it was gone. I never did get that MRI. Fast forward to March 2010. I had been a pharmacist for 14 years by then. Gina and I decided it was time to lose some weight. Those two aren't related, but that's how it happened. Do you remember the P90X commercials? That guy that was all pumped and full of himself. And we started doing some research on the program. A coworker with a death wish had a copy of the P90X program and he let me borrow it. He laughed out loud at me when I told him I watched the first video laying on the couch. I did. Gina and I determined that P90X would kill us, which seemed pointless. But that program's predecessor was a program called the Power 90. It seemed like something we might survive. It's the same guy in the videos, but in this series, he would stop just this side of death. So we bought that program and we got busy. It was working great. We were losing weight and getting stronger, and it was a 90-day program, and we exercised hard 6 days a week during those 3 months. At the end, I had lost 35 pounds, and I don't have a clue. We won't talk about it. We both did well. A short time after the program finished, I began to have some familiar symptoms, tingling in the right side of my head and loss of proprioception in my left arm and hand. I remember being at work at the hospital when it happened, and I deliberately went for a short walk because I wanted to be able to describe the symptoms, like what did and didn't affect me. It never affected my walking or my speech, as far as I knew. At least they didn't tell me. I told Gina, and she may or may not have strongly suggested that I go see my doctor. I'm going to take We had pharmacy doctoral students in our office at the time. They happened to rotate through our office. And they had some minimal experience in neuro exams. One time when the symptoms happened, I turned around in my chair and announced, "It's happening!" And they kind of ran me through a couple simple checks, but the symptoms went away quickly. After a week or two of this, I made an appointment to see my doctor. They finally, the students, my wife, nagging, "Go see your doctor." Okay. I remember talking to my dad on the phone on the way to the doctor before it was illegal to hold your phone while driving. I think that was June 3rd, 2010, thereabouts. And it started happening again, the symptoms, as I was driving past the fire station downtown. It's that vivid in my memory. I got off the phone and made it to the doctor's office, but it happened again in the parking lot, and my left hand wouldn't work to open the car door. Well, that's serious. And as you can see as I walked up here, nerves kind of rattle me a little bit more than they used to, but they betray me and they reveal that I'm a little nervous. Things shake and rattle around like crazy. So the doctor saw me and as all those years before, there were no symptoms during the exam. The doctor said to me, "You know you're getting an MRI, right?" Fortunately, I had insurance this time. I said, "Yeah, I figured. It seems like I should." This was Friday, June 4th, 2010. I got the MRI and I think I went back to work. I'm not sure about that. But when I arrived home, the phone was ringing as I walked in the door. It was the doctor himself. He said something like, "They found something." Those words aren't exact, but something like that. I remember thinking all along during this process, it can't be a tumor. It wouldn't have stopped for all those years, only to crop up now. Regardless, I told the doc, "I'm going to sit down." You're supposed to sit down when you hear serious news. That's how they do it on TV. Cue dramatic music. The doc says, "You have an arteriovenous malformation, an AVM for short, in the cerebral cortex of your brain." I don't remember if he described what that meant or if I knew. I may have known because I had a coworker. Who had graduated with a guy who had an AVM that had ruptured in his brain. He survived, but I don't remember if I knew his condition at the time. I only heard a couple of stories, and I can't remember if I connected the dots, that we even had the same condition. I just don't remember. I eventually did, but I don't remember if I knew at that time. Either way, the doctor told me he had called the neurosurgeons in Eugene and Portland, and Eugene said it was too big for them to deal with. Portland at OHSU was accepting me, and I was to get my family together, pack a bag, and head north after picking up a copy of my MRI at my hospital. I called Gina, who was on her way home, and told her they had found something called an AVM, and there was a surgeon up in Portland who would take my case. My brother Kevin and I owned a small sound system business at the time, and had a big fundraiser event to do that night over at Good Sam Hospital in Corvallis. This wasn't fair to him, but I called Kevin and gave him the rundown. I asked him to do the event by himself. I said something like, "It looks like I need brain surgery. You're going to have to do the sound gig." I'm sure there was more I don't remember.
An interesting story on my side of the aisle here. So the people that ended up being called to staff that sound gig were my event technology classmates. It was a class I took in high school. It was all sound technology and that kind of stuff, stagecraft. And I walked into the class the day after my dad went up to OHSU, and a few of them looked at me like they'd seen a ghost. And they asked how my dad was doing, and I had no idea they knew anything or very much, and no idea how they knew. So I kind of gave a brief answer, and they're like, "Yeah, we heard he had something big happen medically." And freshman me, still not fully grasping the gravity of the situation. Like, oh yeah, it just sounds like he's going to have some brain surgery. And they kind of distanced themselves after that. They didn't know what to say either. They're all high schoolers. And we started working on setting up the stage for a band concert, I think, and lifting heavy stage extensions around and whatnot. And apparently the word got around to the teacher of that class, Mr. Welsh. Some of those that went to West Albany would know him. Actually, more than that, probably know who he is. And he cornered me while we were working on the projects for the day and asked, "Why are you still here?" And it's kind of the moment where that hit me, and that my tough facade was broken. And I started to try to hold back tears and said I didn't really have a choice. And he gave me a hug, and that's something he never really does, although he's one of the teachers that probably cares the most out of anybody there. And very seriously told me to let him know if he could do anything for me. And that's just one of many examples of people coming around to support the family that was still at home.
Pause button. This cracks me up. Comedian Brian Regan describes the me monster in his comedy routine. It's the guy that can basically one-up any story and isn't afraid to do so. You better not tell a two wisdom tooth tale around a me monster, or he'll parachute in with his tale of 6 wisdom teeth, all impacted around his jaw, etc., etc. Brian says, "I'd just like to be one of the 12 people on our planet that have walked on the face of the moon." The me monster would be going on with his tales of adventure and world domination, while you just let him run with the line. When he finally gets done, you just simply say, "I walked on the moon." You can't beat that story. So my brothers, each of which have had multiple knee surgeries and one a neck surgery, should have known better than to tell a 2 or 3 knee surgery or 1 neck surgery tale around me, because I was about to have the surgical equivalent of walking on the moon. To this day, I just say, "I walked on the moon." Back to the story. So when Gina got home, Janice had come over to help with the kids and to pray with us. She packed our bags, and we set our sights on OHSU. I called my brothers and my dad and Pastor Steve. I remember telling Pastor Steve, if something goes way wrong, Gina gets all my stuff. And I wrote it on a sticky note on our desk, and while trying to remain calm, I probably wasn't technically of sound mind.
I still have that sticky note.
She saved it, I have no idea why. I think she wants my stuff. I'm no longer of sound mind.
You lost your marbles.
So we got up there. This is our view from my first room in the Kohler wing. We got up there, and I was directly admitted at around 7:30 that evening. OHSU is a teaching hospital, so a parade of medical students and residents began to come through, and I was asked the same questions over and over. One of them took our copy of the MRI. Things were kind of winding down for the weekend on a Friday evening, so there wasn't a lot of information forthcoming. On Saturday, they took me for an angiogram. They can guide a catheter, the miracles of modern medicine. They can guide a catheter from the femoral artery in your groin up into the neck and even into the brain.
Wow.
Dye is injected while images are captured with sort of a real-time x-ray. This is the universal symbol for real-time x-ray. This helped them see the structure of the AVM better. So let me take a few minutes to describe what an AVM is and isn't. Picture there. So in normal vasculature, all arteries except the pulmonary artery leave the heart to deliver oxygen to the body. Basic anatomy. They become smaller vessels called arterioles, and as they get further from the heart into the tissues, they finally turn into capillaries where oxygen is exchanged into the tissues of our bodies. From there, capillaries go to bigger venules, and then back to veins and back to the heart. And that's the circulatory system. In an AVM, do I have my pointer? Here it is. In an AVM, the arteries go right into veins without going into smaller capillaries first, where the speed and pressure is reduced. So this is what they call the nidus of the AVM, and they're arteries and veins that just don't communicate right. So they don't go into the capillaries first, where speed and pressure would normally be reduced. Because of this, the pressure is higher in this area, making the area prone to, or at least a higher risk to rupture. An AVM is not an aneurysm. An aneurysm is a sort of ballooning out of the edge of the blood vessel, kind of like a weak tire or inner tube that has a bulge in it. You ever seen a ball or something that's got that bulge? That's kind of like what an aneurysm is. So an AVM and an aneurysm are different, but both are prone to rupture and potentially cause harm. At some point, we learned my AVM had 5 arteries going into it, leading to veins inappropriately. We were told the whole mess of blood vessels was about the size of a kiwi. Was a kiwi about that big? Give or take. And it would likely be fatal if it ever ruptured on its own. Gina tells me it was the hotshot surgeon that told us all of that. I don't remember ever seeing that head surgeon. I know what he looks like too, and I don't remember ever seeing him.
During this time, we both spent a lot of time in prayer, how to proceed with whatever may come. We both came to the conclusion, independently, that in our hearts, there wasn't any reason why Scott wouldn't make it through this surgery. And our faith was that he was walking out of the hospital the same person he walked in. Just as it is written in Matthew 21:22, I tell you the truth. If you have faith and don't doubt, you can do things like this and much more. You can even say to the mountain, may you be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and it will happen. Call it crazy, naive, or whatever you want, but it was the only way that we could get through this, having unwavering faith.
On Monday the 7th, they did an embolization or a clotting procedure, where they again got a catheter from the femoral artery all the way up into the brain to these specific arteries in the AVM to basically fill them with glue. So we got a picture up here, and this is actually my brain, not on drugs. Go back to the first one, Jordan. So right there, it's hard to see, but that is the skull right there, and he's got them numbered, and I think she's going to try to 1, 2, and 3, or he calls them feeder vessels, that go into that whole mess of blood vessels right there. And then the next slide. And then what he's got circled there in bad doctor handwriting, that says the word motor. So that circle is what they call the left side motor core. And so that's what controls the left side of a person's body is in that area. Yeah, so what she's circling there is, and what he wrote, feeder vessels not embolized. So there were 5 vessels, 3 of which were embolized, and 2 of which were not.
The top up there in the gray, you can see it says embolization. That's where they had started the embolization, and you can see how the blood was starting to leave the AVM at that point.
When they put glue in your brain, blood doesn't flow as well as it should. That's a good thing in this case. Where are we? Okay. All right. So as I said earlier, 3 vessels, 2 of them could be embolized, 2 of them couldn't because it was not safe. A few hours later, they did a 3D mapping MRI with fancy donuts on my head. Do we have the donuts picture? There it is. So they do that because they can get a very detailed 3-dimensional image of the brain, and that helps them prepare for surgery and do surgery. Pretty fancy stuff. And I just have them in my notes. I don't have any recollection of that day at all. The next day, the 8th, I went into surgery to have the whole mess removed. And from the 7th on, I'm relying on what was told to me, because it will be a little over a month before I have any memories of anything. The surgery was done, and I was sent to the neuro ICU.
2:15 p.m., Tuesday, June 8th. I left him as he was taken off the surgery. I have to admit at this point, I was on autopilot. My goal was to be present as a level head, decision maker, and stability for the family involved. It allowed me to remove emotion from the equation. As we, my father-in-law and I, walked into the waiting room, familiar faces began to emerge. An unexpected but very welcome presence from several in our church. They sat with the family, prayed with us, distracted us, as we waited the long 3.5 hours until the surgeon found us and let us know he had made it through surgery. It ended up being more complex than they had expected, and he had bled a lot. 4 units of blood were given, an intracranial drain was placed to relieve the pressure of the swelling of the brain, screws to hold in the bone, they removed in place. Yes, now we can joke that he has screws loose.
It's true.
And many, many staples. So about this time, Janice, our youth pastor, who was sitting with me in the hallway, we were kind of sitting out there because there was no cell reception in the waiting room that we were in, and that's how they were supposed to contact me. So she's sitting out in the hall with me, and the surgeon walks out of the elevator to come fill me with the information that he had. And she kind of looks to this surgeon, and she always has a way of kind of breaking the tension by just throwing a joke in. And she goes, "But did you get all his marbles back in? He was particularly fond of the shiny ones." All of us sitting there just laughed. And, well, the neurosurgeon was stone silent. It was very awkward. He ignored the question and went on to more descriptions and then left. Another hour and a half sitting, waiting to hear if he had made it back to recovery in ICU. It was a slight shock to see the doozy of a battle scar they gave him, almost ear to ear, but I was reminded that that was minor. He was there, and he was doing well.
Pause. There is a picture coming up of a scar with a drain tube coming out of my head. Just a warning if anybody needs to look away. It's not gross, in my opinion.
You also work in a hospital.
Yeah.
Wednesday, the next day, 2:35 a.m. I was awoken from a dead sleep with a phone call from ICU. They had taken Scott for a second post-op CT scan, and the surgery site was bleeding again. After a verbal release, he was off to surgery again. I sat up with Peg for several hours, anxious, unable to sleep. Fortunately, once the surgeon was inside, they found the bleed and a clot, which they remedied. Another close, more stitches, and a CT scan to confirm the fix, and back to ICU. And there's the picture. He's got essentially from here all the way down.
It's kind of hard to see.
Another one up here, and the drain in the top. So, some good railroad tracks.
A good story to tell when I go bald.
Oh, goodness.
It's coming.
It was a long night. They kept Scott heavily sedated into the next morning, not wanting any extra stress on the brain. The goal was 2 clear CT scans, then they would try to lift sedation. At this point, the goal was 2 to 3 days of ICU. The next few days were uneventful. Sedation, waiting for the brain swelling to go down. I was taking one day at a time. The big picture, too ominous. I focused on what was to be tackled the next day. Because he was in ICU, I couldn't be there with him all night, so each night I would return to my in-laws in Lake Oswego, call my parents and kids, and probably a bit therapeutically posted to our care pages. I've got a book of about 420 pages of this whole story and everybody's responses. The site was a huge help to me, a way to get all the information out to a large group of people and for them to interact with me. It truly took a village to get me through. Not only were people empathetic, they posted encouragement and prayer. I look forward to reading it every night. It was also a way for Scott's colleagues to contact me and tell me what I should be doing, questions I should be asking, people to talk to. Ultimately, giving me direction in all this. I could not have done what I did without all of the help, and I can never thank people enough for all they did to help me. By Friday of that week, they were starting to lift the paralytic. We had hopes and prayers that all would go as planned, but nothing is ever easy, right? He started with a slight fever, which ended up rising to over 103. Ended up with him tremoring in the first round of pneumonia. A quick move was issued over to neuro ICU, Arctic cooling blankets, and lots of meds being pushed. It made for a long, scary evening. His body was angry. It was reacting poorly to waking up, as well as an infection. So after hours, several hours, he finally stabilized. We continued with sedation and lots of waiting. During this time, I had a team that kept my family working. Friends and family that stepped in and made sure the kids had a somewhat normal day, got them to school, housed them, fed them, and kept us intact. I had the church and the Albany Hospital who stepped up and had meals prepared. Co-workers that helped me navigate insurance policies, vacation pay, long-term disability. School secretaries that stepped in and helped me navigate meal plans. People who volunteered to help pay my bills. We had no income for several months. So that was a bit ominous, just not knowing when this would end. In a workplace that fully supported Scott's leave and held his job until he could return. None of which I could have done in the condition I was in or stress I was under by myself. And for that, I say thank you. Now for the next few days, they seemed to blur together. It seemed like the same thing each day. They would try for a reduction in sedation, and his body wasn't having any of it. Tremors, spikes in body temperatures, Arctic blankets, no real progress. They would put him back under. His brain needed longer to recover, they would tell us. In this time, he spent his 38th birthday heavily sedated and unaware any of this was going on.
I don't have to count that.
So each day we waited, prayed, and knew God was waiting for his moment to perform that miracle. We went through multiple CT scans, 10 in all, MRIs, we had 3 of those, EEGs, 3 of those, each of them coming back, as they say, unremarkable. Hated that word. Nothing that they could see that was causing a problem. Another bout of pneumonia, a bad reaction to a medication causing more fevers and trembling, blood clots and filters placed, multiple central lines having to be replaced, and lots of decisions having to be made in the moment. So if you can see this, he was doing quality control on the pharmacy. There was probably about 8 different pumps running in this picture and lines everywhere, as well as he was intubated and sedated. So it was a bit ominous in there with all the beeps and stuff going on.
You hear me? Save your place. I'm going to interject here one thing that's not in our notes. I spoke to one of my anesthesiologist friends in the hospital. When we do somebody's carotid surgery, we'll put them on a blood pressure lowering medication to make sure that fix doesn't blow. And so I thought, well, good grief, if it's in your brain, you really don't want that to blow, right? So I asked Gina, was there anything, and I kind of described to her what it looked like, because he's usually in a dark bag. Anyway, I was having this conversation with a doctor, and he says, well, in the neuro world, that's a very delicate balance. That tube, or one very similar to it in my head, can measure what they call the intracranial pressure in your brain. And so they do a calculation of your mean arterial pressure, and then those 2 numbers have to be very close. And if the intracranial pressure is higher than your mean arterial pressure, blah, 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 then you're at risk for rupture. So it's a very delicate balancing act. It's not just as simple as turn the drug on and everything will be fine. Unpause.
Eventually, after 10 days of this roller coaster, we got to a place where they could remove sedation, most of his pain medication, and he would be awake for short bouts. Interactions were through a fog. His brain was trying, his body completely uncooperative. He was considered a complete quadriplegic. He had a response to stimulus in all 4 limbs, but he had very little control over any of it. So they could poke it with like a sharp pin, and he would respond to it, or like grasp his hand or curl his toes. But if you asked him to move his toes, he couldn't do that on his own. Grasp with the hand or sticking out of the tongue and respond to questions. He was still intubated. His eyes would follow me around the room. We all cried Father's Day. When we walked in, the nurse was so excited because he had a long bout of clarity and responsiveness. That fog finally started lifting for periods. He was responding directly to our questions. We were asking him questions, and he'd stick out his tongue for yes and, blink his eyes for no and things like that. You can't tell me God doesn't answer prayer. And it was the day after all of our friends and family had taken time and devoted prayer here for us that all this happened. This was over 2 weeks in on what was supposed to be a week journey and go home. Then it was a third bout with pneumonia and a complete change out of his respiratory tubes. The staples and stitches finally came out, and this is his wonderful looking
Railroad tracks.
he's got there.
I walked on the moon.
We still had a way to go. At this point, they finally made the decision to insert a feeding tube and a trach. So this is him. The lights are on, but nobody's home. He's very foggy at this point. Really can't interact much. And I have to say, it's the worst diet ever. He was down over 30 pounds from his admit weight at this point, and I was down 25 myself.
Haven't already lost 35 on purpose.
He was a twig. We celebrated for him, praying this would mean an easier time for him. Now it was on to recovery, each day a tiny bit clearer. They had him sitting up in a cardiac chair for a few hours. The nurses would try to stretch out his limbs and alleviate some of the tense muscles in what they called clonus. So if you see in the picture there, his arm is like really, really tight, and that was his body's reaction to what was going on. It just tightened everything in, and you literally could not peel his arm down. It was so tight.
It's one of the indications of brain damage. I think it's called decorticate posturing, and it's not good.
Actually, it's not. Very few of his movements were intentional. It was at this point the kids were allowed to see their dad for the first time. I was very protective of them through this whole process and never wanted them to have the memory of their dad all hooked up to the tubes and wires. Tim was very young. He was very apprehensive. Dad looked very different. The girls warmed up fairly quickly, and thankfully at that time Scott was fairly coherent and responsive to them. Things started progressing slightly faster at this point. Our goal became escaping neuro ICU and getting a room with a view. For the fourth, more muscles were coming back on board. The best description I heard of what happened to his head was likening it to a filing cabinet. Someone took out all the drawers and dumped them all over the floor.
Felt like they set him on fire.
All the papers were still there. Scott's brain was still there. The blood vessels, papers, just needed to reroute and reorganize. As they did that, more processes came back, slowly but steady. A toe here, a smile there, a double thumbs up in response to questions. Eventually it was learning to talk around the trach, and him telling all of us he was still walking out. On July 2nd was the day we escaped. A room with a view, 10th floor overlooking the city once again. So far, 24 days into the process. This is his room up there. I moved back into his room, sleeping in the recliner. Nurses in the neuro unit are amazing. But having one for about every 5 patients makes it so that no one patient gets a lot of individual attention. The sickest, not him, get more. Now our goal shifted. For him to be released to either a skilled nursing facility or a rehab, he had to be off the trach and feeding tube. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy each came weekdays, not holidays or weekends, for a half hour each day. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, then standing, likened to a baby giraffe with a therapist who was significantly shorter than him. Stretching the tight muscles and working on physically eating. In between therapy sessions, I took it upon myself to work on specific skills with him that they gave me. Every opportunity we got, I would get him to eat. First ice chips, then puddings and ice creams, eventually give him the okay for soft foods. The feeding tube then went away, respirations eventually cleared, and they removed the trach. This was over days. TV at that time was too stimulating. It caused him a lot of anxiety because he couldn't distinguish TV from reality. Like we were watching, I think it was Pet Detective, and he was so worried that the dogs on TV were loose in the room, and he couldn't figure out where and how to get the dogs back in the TV. So that went off.
I don't remember that.
He spent hours plugged into his brother's iPod. Music is supposed to help healing, and it significantly calmed him. Now that we had jumped those hurdles, we as a family waited anxiously for the next steps. Decisions had to be made by the doctors and therapists. And eventually we scored an evaluation with one of the leading stroke rehab places in Portland, Rio. Rehab Institute of Oregon at Legacy Emmanuel. They were impressed by his recent exponential rate of recovery, and much to our delight, accepted him. Now it was on to the toughest part of recovery. July 9th, we escaped OHSU, 34 days after we walked in the doors.
You can't start to cry before you get to me.
Sorry.
So I had an intracranial hemorrhage or a hemorrhagic stroke a couple days before my 38th birthday. I was admitted to the Rehabilitation Institute of Oregon, or RIO. I think we have a picture.
Yep.
Is that the RIO?
That was the first night.
I don't remember that room yet. My memories don't come online until a couple weeks or so into that stay. Over the past 7.5 years, give or take, I've asked Gina about memories from Rio that I thought happened on the first day, and she would say, no, that was about 2 weeks in or so. Placing memory in time is tricky. One of the effects of this whole thing has been a lack of short-term memory. I'm told I would have the same conversation many times. And one of the effects of this whole thing is the lack of short-term memory. I'm told that I would have... I think they got it. One of my first memories from Rio was sitting in the speech therapist's office. And I don't remember having a problem with speech, but they deal with a lot of the processing of information and things like that.
Speech is anything from the head up, so it's speaking, it's swallowing, it's visual, all that sort of stuff.
I remember sitting in the speech therapist's office, and remember she had pictures of real money on the table. And this is one of those things where I asked Gina, that was the day I got there, right? I should have known that was about 2.5 weeks in. She had pictures of money or real money on the table. They looked familiar, and I was very aware that I used to know what these things were, but I couldn't remember what they were. I was also unable, and I remember that like it was yesterday, I was unable to pick anything up with either hand. I think I was still considered a quadriplegic.
No fine motor dexterity at all.
One of the many good things about Rio was the amount of time I got, the amount of rest time I got. These therapy sessions were exhausting. And after the speech therapy session, I remember laying in bed thinking, yes, I am tired. And as quickly as I had that thought, I was terrified. How in the world would I support a family? Wow. That sure is a great view of the roof from the window. How did I get here? Where am I again? Who put all those pictures of cars on my wall? This is a nice place. I don't like those tires. I think I used to be pretty good at math. I like this song. That's how my brain worked.
During these weeks, I would spend 14-hour days at rehab with Scott, learning everything I could. Some weekends I had the kids in Portland with me, my in-laws entertaining them during the day, and me spending time with them at night. I would take them to rehab on the slower weekends to interact with their dad.
I've always kind of had a responsibility complex, and and this was like really amplified in this time. I felt like I was responsible for holding down the fort at home, even though, like, looking back on it, I really had very little of that responsibility, and like that was where I could contribute the most. And as a result, I never really lost this control complex. They say that when you go through trauma, there's always something left behind. And in my case, that was the sense that I needed to know that what was going on at all. I needed to know what was going on at all times, and if it was something I could control, I would try to. And I also remember feeling really alone through this process. I feel like there were two types of people that would approach me. There were people that just didn't know what to say, and so they avoided me. And that was usually people that were closer to my age. And there was also people who felt like I needed all the advice and help in the world and tried to give me it. And it was just all super overwhelming. I remember really craving doing things that were normal. And I think, normal. And I think those are some of my most cherished times in the whole process. I think the things I appreciated most were things like people taking us school shopping or to the library or even out to ice cream. And I have really fond memories of Grandpa Chris convincing the nurses to let us ride the OHSU tram. And
Multiple times,
yeah. He'd wait till the shift changed and then convince the next nurse to let us And then him and Kevin convincing us to try the taco salads that were bigger than our heads, and Kevin convinced us to try the froyo. And every time I saw him at OHSU, he had a cup of froyo in his hand. Apparently it was that good. I don't remember it much, but yeah.
I remember standing for the first time like it was yesterday. So we're going to show a video of that. Have the sound on too. Watch the head. Baby giraffe. Here we go.
Look up, Scott. Look up. Up at the ceiling. Come on. The last hand. Go. Stand up tall. Go, 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 go. Good job.
I was surprised how hard that was. I think that's about it. My roommate at the time was a former Olympic snowboarder from Hood River here in Oregon. He had been injured in an accident, and it's not a HIPAA violation because I wasn't a medical professional, I was just his roommate. And I'm not going to tell his name. But he had been injured in a bicycling accident and wasn't supposed to be walking unassisted. Because I think he had a bit of a head injury or something. But he would occasionally just get up and go to the bathroom. And I remember thinking, I'm this way because they told me I'm this way. I can walk. Evidently I could not, as you can see how hard that was. The therapists and doctors had warned Gina that people with right side brain injuries tend to be a little bit impulsive. And as you could probably tell from the video, there was going to be no walking. I wasn't even able to sit up without falling in any given direction, and that actually continued for quite a while. So, do you want to see what real angels look like? That's how I got moved around a lot. No, I'm going to skip ahead. Towards the end of my stay there one time, I did get to fly like Peter Pan. There was a doctor there that I didn't remember seeing, and he winched me up, and I was trying to climb stairs or something, and I just jumped off the top of him and flew like Peter Pan, and he raised me all the way up. And Anyway, that's Carla. Carla's the shorter one. Christina's on her knees there on the mat there. Anyway, that's how I got transported to. Can't hardly hold my head up, and I again remember that like it was yesterday. So yeah, angels. So we're just lessening the notes here now, but that's what they call a standing frame. And I remember loving that and hating it. So it was, I think I liked it because it was different and I actually got to put some weight on my feet, but every part of me was strapped in. My shoes, I think my knees and my hips and my chest was strapped around so it would hold me upright. But then it was exhausting just standing there, even though I was very well supported. And I think what we did, 2 minutes, and I was just sweat. So that was a good thing. And then that's a similar version of it, and that's Carla. I told you she was short. She's standing on a table. But yeah, so that was just. So then, as they tried to start to teach me to kind of sort of do what my version of walking was, Carla would hold my shoulders and Christina would pull one leg at a time, and I had that sort of walker in one hand. Yeah. And then that's Carla again, all by her little self. So what you can't see there, right in the right side corner, I'm pointing it there, but you're looking up there. There's a mirror, and there I'm looking in the mirror, and on the mirror there's a line that goes down the center of it, and it was weird because I would, when I stood, I would be standing off to the side, and they'd say, stand up straight. I couldn't tell that I wasn't straight. And what's next? And again, two therapists working to get me to stand up straight. One of the interesting, this is just really fascinating to me how the brain works. one of the things that I had was what they call left hemi neglect. So they would give me things to read and I could read fine, but none of it ever made any sense. And the reason was because it's a known medical thing, especially with right brain injured people. I ignored everything in my left field of vision. And if you told me it was there, I could see it just fine. But I remember a time at Rio, I was wheeling down down the hallway in my wheelchair, and it just stopped. And I was like, and I started to get angry and kind of yell, and Gina was behind me, as she often was, and she said, "Scott, look to your left." And I was literally up against the wall. I had no idea. And this went on even after I was discharged home. I would be eating dinner at the table, sitting in my chair, and I'd get done and lean back, and she would say, "Are you full?" "No, I'm done." And she'd turn my plate 180 degrees, and half the plate of food would still be there. So that was a pretty big thing. And I, again, thinking about my job, and at the time we read doctor's orders off paper, and so you can't be skipping half the medical order, right? So I remember the therapist, this is what I remember fixing, and I read quite a bit on left hemi neglect. Oftentimes they have to put prisms in your glasses to make people see both sides, and it can be a very, very hard thing to overcome. But I remember the speech therapist took a yellow highlighter and drew down the left margin on the paper and said, "Okay, every time you get to the end of the line," it was like I was 5 years old. "Every time you get to the end of the line, take your eyes all the way back to the yellow line." Remember, I had no short-term memory, so that would work for about 2 lines. But so this sort of repetition, it just took a long time. So is it your turn now? Is it my turn? Okay. So in November of that same year, my speech therapist started to talk about going back to work. My boss had one of our tall counters we had counters about this tall. He had it lowered so I could roll up in my wheelchair and work. I worked with supervision for a while, but by this point, getting to do things I was familiar with gave me a sense of accomplishment and a great deal of comfort, ironically. I was nervous, but it was very comfortable. Being in a familiar environment made things come back even faster. I struggled with math for a while and had to use a calculator more than I was used to, but that was fine. Things continued, and I told my boss about that. He's like, "Well, that's what it's like when you get to your 50s, so don't even worry about it." Things continued to improve. When I was a year out from the stroke, I remember telling my therapist at the hospital I was discouraged that I hadn't made more improvement. I had the understanding that a stroke patient can get good recovery for about a year. I was wrong. In fact, they both looked at me like I was a bit crazy and was maybe a weirdo. They said that used to be sort of the theory, but the experts are finding ongoing recovery forever with continued work. It's called neuroplasticity. You may have seen some commercials that talk about neuroplasticity. This is not a commercial for that product. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself, I call it rewiring, by forming new neural connections throughout life. Neuroplasticity allows the neurons, or the nerve cells in the brain, to compensate for injury and disease, and to adjust their activities in response to new situations or to changes in their environment. Somebody today just told me you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That is scientific proof that in fact you can. Psalms 139:14 says, take a drink first. I'm supposed to think of it in your head before I say it. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully. Almost there. Fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I read this verse at the beginning, and I want to close with it to bring us things full circle. Proverbs 16:9. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. I think about this a lot. Had I figured out a way to pay for that MRI back in the 90s when this all started, the same scenario played out, or worse, I never would have been able to finish pharmacy school, and it's scary to think what else.
The technology back then wasn't anything like it is now, and he probably would not have made it through.
So, that's the story. Recovery continues. Amen. So we're going to switch gears at this point, and here's a picture. That's one of the recovery pictures. That's what's called a sable brace, and I have a hard time opening this hand. That finger's in its shapes too. So that helped me kind of open, and I could practice moving those little rubber balls from place to place and get shoulder movement and all kinds of stuff. So I moved a lot of balls. I did it 1,000 in 45 minutes. I had to time myself, or at least I took it as a challenge and time myself.
Threw him across the picture.
Everything was a challenge.
Yeah, so drenched in sweat, and it made a good time out of it. Anyway. Did we do this? So I'm going to switch gears, said that, and show you a picture of God's people praying.
That's this church.
Isn't that you? Did you say that? I don't say that.
It's my turn. June 17th, 6:30 to 7 p.m., a special prayer time was set aside for our family. The word was shared via email, care pages, people shared it by prayer chains in multiple churches, and in their homes they prayed for us. As far as we know, hundreds of people, truly humbling.
Thank you.
Yes.
James instructs us to call on the elders of the church. Call on the elders of the church to pray over us so they can anoint us with oil in the name of the Lord. When there is more than one person praying, it can be powerful. The scripture reads, "Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered up in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective." James echoed what Jesus said about bringing people together to pray. "Again, I tell you the truth." This is what Jesus said. "Again, I tell you the truth, that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven." At this point, we're going to turn the video off. So thank you for joining us if you've joined us online. And